Okay, I think we'll start. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. Thank you all very much for coming. Sorry about the slight delay. Gary, having travelled all around America, got snarled up in Manchester traffic, I'm afraid. So good evening, and thank you all for coming to tonight's event. This is the third Arthur Lewis annual lecture being hosted by the School of Social Sciences. I'm Claire Alexander, and I'm in the Department of Sociology. And it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome and introduce tonight's speaker, Gary Younge. And I think looking at the number of people that are here tonight on quite a cold night, I'm guessing Gary doesn't really need any introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway, because I've written it, and I'll keep it short. So Gary is an award-winning author, broadcaster, and journalist. He's worked at The Guardian since 1993 and was appointed as their US correspondent in 2003. Lucky for us, he came back to the UK in 2015, and he's currently The Guardian's editor-at-large. He also writes a monthly column for The Nation. Gary's won a number of awards for his journalism, most recently this year, the James Aronson Career Achievement Award from City University of New York. He's made a number of radio and TV documentaries on a wide range of subjects, and actually there's one airing tonight on Channel 4 at 10 o'clock, Angry, White and American, which sounds like a joyous combination. So for those of you that want to spend the whole evening with Gary, this is your chance. Gary's also the author of 5 books. The most recent is this wonderful and absolutely heartbreaking award-winning book, Another Day in the Death of America. And I think that there will be copies outside for people that want to buy a copy. I would really recommend it. It's probably the book that most of the academics in the room would have wished they'd written. But if you do buy it, don't do what I did and read it on a train, because it will make you cry and cry and cry, and people will look at you like you're insane. So, A Day in the Death of America, like all of Gary's work, is defined not only by his insights and understanding, but also by his compassion and his humanity. And like Arthur Lewis, who was a Nobel Prize-winning development economist, also with roots in the Caribbean, Gary's work aims not only to understand the world, but also to change it. So I'm going to pass you over to Gary for tonight's lecture. And Gary, we're truly delighted to welcome you to Manchester, and we're really sorry about the traffic.
So thank you, Claire, and thank you, Helen, who've, between them, both invited me and organised for me to come. It's been a bit of a strange week for me. I'm not sure if any of you saw a clip of me interviewing the leader of the American alt-right, which has gone around quite a lot, and I fear that having spent most of my career trying to navigate the nuances of race and class and occasionally gender and nationality and identity, both here and in America, I may well end up being most known for going shouty crackers at a Nazi in a car park. Them's the breaks. I studied French and Russian, and that involves some study abroad. And as a language student, during the dying days of the Soviet Union, I lived with a woman and her son in what was then still Leningrad and now St. Petersburg. And every weekday evening around 8:45, my hostess would get herself ready to take their dog, a cocker spaniel called Reddick, for a walk. Now, since I'm no lover of the cold and not a great lover of dogs, I would watch with amusement as she readied herself and Reddick for the trip to the local park, and by 8:55 she'd be out the door. You could set your watch by her. Everybody has their routines, and I thought little of it until spring came and I decided one night to accompany her. And I noticed a slight urgency in her voice as she stood by the door, lead in hand, while I combed the flat for my hat. We made it out on time, though on time for what wasn't exactly clear, and arrived at the park to find scores of dog owners already there or arriving. "What's this?" I asked. "It looks like a meeting." "We call it the dog hour," she explained. "It's when the state news, Vremya, is on, and we don't want to listen to the propaganda, so we walk our dogs." It was a collective, non-showy act of civil disobedience against a political culture that had left information sources so polluted that they were no longer worthy of even decoding. And there's been many a day since when I have looked at what passes for news, in screen or in print, and wished I did like dogs just so that I could take one for a walk in those moments and see who would join me. Not because we live in a totalitarian state that dictates what the news should be, but because we live in an ostensibly democratic state in which the fate of large sections of society are written out of the news agenda in ways which I will illustrate, forcing a reckoning with the nature of the democracy we live in. Our understanding of what constitutes news is supposed to be self-explanatory. The most widely known aphorism regarding what constitutes a story, which I learned when I did my postgrad in journalism, which is attributed either to Alfred Helmsworth, an early 19th century British newspaper magnate, or New York Sun editor John Bogard of the same period, states simply, when a dog bites a man, that's not news, because it happens so often. But if a man bites a dog, that's news. But over the past few years, I've wondered if there might be an addendum to that adage, a qualifying footnote to what seems like the obvious. Because sometimes events derive their potential news value precisely because they happen so often. That there are things that happen with such regularity and predictability that journalists have simply ceased to recognize their value, not least if those things are least likely to happen to the people most likely to be journalists. That much of what we've come to accept as commonplace has dulled our curiosity to why so much of what is commonplace is unacceptable. That given the prevailing and escalating inequalities and inequities, we simply do not occupy the same worlds we portend to cover, even when those worlds are right on our doorstep. That there is value in asking sometimes, why do these dogs keep biting people? Who owns these dogs? And why do the same people keep being bitten? Hence the title, Who Let the Dogs Out? The Politics of Reporting Race and Violence, which I want to illustrate at some length with examples from the book that I've written called Another Day in the Death of America, and a series I've been running at The Guardian this year called Beyond the Blade. The book is premised on the fact that every day, on average, 7 children or teens are shot dead in America. I picked a day at random, November the 23rd, 2013, and then set out over the next 2 years to find out who these kids were, seeking out everyone who knew them, from their parents to their pastors and basketball coaches. 10 kids were shot dead that day across the country. The youngest was 9, the eldest just a few days shy of his 20th birthday. The series sets out to cover a similar cohort, teens and younger, but a different tragedy. All the children and teens in Britain killed by knives, mapping the number of children who were killed, and also looking at the themes that emerge from that. Now, being a journalist, I want to start with the facts, or rather the things we think we know. In her biography of Harlem Renaissance writer Zora Neale Hurston, Valerie Boyd explained why it was so difficult to track Hurston's whereabouts during the writer's early 20s. In 1911, it was relatively easy for someone, particularly a black woman, to avoid history's recording gaze, wrote Boyd in Wrapped in Rainbows. If not legally linked to a man as daughter or wife, black women didn't count in some ways, at least to the people who did the official counting. That question of who counts and whom is counted is not simply a matter of numbers. It's also about power. Collecting information, particularly about people, demands both the authority to gather data and the capacity to keep and transmit it. Those who have both the authority and the capacity need to feel that those they are keeping tabs on matter. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, as the dead floated in the street and the living were stranded on highways and rooftops, a huge crowd of mostly black and poor people descended on the city's convention center. When asked why relief organizations had been caught off guard, the hapless director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, Michael Brown, responded, "We're seeing people that we didn't know existed." Rarely has a truer word been said. The growing political and economic inequalities, both within nations and between them, is not only replicated at times in journalism, but is increasingly being amplified by it. And the upshot is an elite consensus episodically shattered by the intrusion of more democratic forms of new technology, but never ultimately displaced. In short, not everybody counts, and therefore not everybody is counted. We still don't know for sure how many people died in Grenfell. Some of them were off the books, which makes you wonder if we aren't all reading the wrong books. We know how many US police officers are killed in the line of duty in any given year, and as we've seen recently, each incident in which they're killed is understood to be newsworthy. But there's no national tally for how many people are killed by US police officers. It's revealing that as far as anyone can make out, there's not been an increase in the number of black people being killed by the US police in the last few years. What there has been is a growing political awareness that has forced a reckoning with a reality that has existed for several years. These shootings are not news in a conventional sense. They are neither rare nor to the communities involved particularly surprising. They are news simply because those who make the news can no longer ignore them. Because, as was the case with Trayvon Martin and others, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram smelled a rat before journalists could. The world hasn't changed. What's changed is our ability to pass off the grotesque as unremarkable. Now, when it comes to what's known as knife crime, and just imagine those words from now on in air quotes, it turns out the facts can be quite elusive. Crimes committed with knives are nothing new. Shakespeare's plays are full of them. But knife crime as a phenomenon is relatively recent. A survey of the National Press and the London Evening Standard in 2000 revealed just one mention of the term. 3 years later, it was up to 24. Coverage peaked in 2008 with 2,602 mentions that year before trending precipitously downwards. But staggeringly, given the amount of column inches devoted to the issue, national data on the number of children and teens killed by knives in any given year is not publicly available. Contact the Home Office and it will tell you that individual police forces collect that information. And they will suggest that you try the Office for National Statistics. Contact the ONS and they will inform you that all the deaths in England and Wales are collated in the Homicide Index, which is maintained by the Home Office. Send a Freedom of Information request to the Home Office and they won't tell you. So while knife crime, particularly as it affects young people, has been the subject of national debate for a decade, our awareness of its true scale is limited. Our grasp of its trajectory is only approximate, and our coverage of it is erratic. In short, as a nation, we are conscious that there is something out there known as knife crime, but as yet we lack any coherent or enduring national response. In his landmark book, Public Opinion, Walter Lippmann wrote, "The only feeling that anyone can have about an event he doesn't experience is the feeling aroused by his mental image of that event. That is why until we know what others think they know, we cannot truly understand their acts. Our opinions cover a bigger space, a longer reach of time, and a greater number of things than we can directly observe. They have therefore to be pieced together out of what others have reported." End quote. The trouble is that what others report when it comes to knife crime is neither neutral nor consistent. Patrick Green, the manager of the Ben Kinsella Trust in London, named after a 16-year-old who was stabbed to death in Islington in 2008, told me the media's response to the murder of young people is inconsistent. Some of these tragic deaths get little or no coverage. These stories are often lost because it's a busy news day or because they consider the young person to be an unworthy victim. The media are more likely to report on the murder when a bright, educated young person from a privileged background is killed, and we all think, how did this happen to them? But we don't hear about or ask the same questions about the murders of young people from more vulnerable backgrounds. And in the absence of facts, prejudice and presumption move in. One thing that became rapidly clear during this series is that knife crime is a construct. It doesn't simply mean, as one might reasonably expect, crimes committed with knives. It denotes a certain type of crime committed by a certain type of criminal in a certain kind of context. As it relates to young people, this construct comprises several elements. The children who commit the crimes are evil, described variously as naturally violent, monsters, and teenage thugs, who populate a section of society that is, and I quote, feral, callous, and bloodthirsty. It's also racialised. In 2007, then Prime Minister Tony Blair told an audience in Cardiff, the black community, the vast majority of whom in these communities are decent, law-abiding people, horrified at what is happening, need to be mobilised in denunciation of this gang culture that is killing innocent young black kids. But we won't stop this by pretending it isn't young black kids doing it. A year earlier, David Cameron, then the opposition leader, suggested in a speech that hip-hop was partly responsible for youth violence. I would say to Radio 1, he said, do you realise that some of the stuff you play on Saturday nights encourages people to carry guns and knives? This resonates beyond the politicians. On social media, when white kids are killed, people opine about the state of youth today, the demise of the town in which they died, or the world in general. But when black kids are killed, usually the assumption is that their race has something to do with it. Just days before a boy called Kumari Barnes, who I'll come on to in a minute, died, Jojo Nsaka, who was 19, was fatally stabbed just 3 miles away from where Kumari was killed, in the shadow of Wembley Stadium. According to his friends, Jojo, a business studies student at Middlesex University, planned to open his own business selling baseball caps with his own designs and dreamed of one day becoming a millionaire. He worked 2 jobs, JD Sports during the week and Tesco's at the weekends, in order to support his family, including his 2-year-old daughter, and to pay his tuition fees. Just a month before, he'd bought Christmas dinner for his mum, dad, and 5 sisters. And yet, a few days after his death, a Conservative councillor in Dover, Bob Frost, posted a news story about Jojo's murder on Twitter with the message, Black Knives Matter. The carnage continues into 2017. Any protest from the community? ? Thought not. It's also understood to be primarily urban and gendered. Now, some of these preconceptions bear some relationship to reality, and some don't. None hold completely. Of the 32 children and teens to have been killed by knives this year, more than a third were outside London, just under a third were white, 20% were in rural or suburban areas, 10% were female, and 10% were age 5 or under. The point is that these are preconceptions based on anecdote that bear the full weight of prejudice and presumption. So much so that of the first 10 kids to be stabbed to death this year, how about that? Bit more. Warmer. Great. So much so that the first 10 kids to be stabbed to death this year, the only stories in which the term knife crime were used in the national press were related to the only 2 black men and the only 2 Londoners who'd been killed at that stage. So some things aren't counted and some people don't count. And even when they do count, they don't necessarily count for much. This became clear in my reporting on gun deaths in the US. One of the boys who died on the day that I covered was Samuel Brightman, a 16-year-old kid who was shot dead in South Dallas while walking down the street with his friend. Under the headline, "Teen Fatally Shot While Walking Down the Street," the Dallas Morning News wrote a single paragraph. In the days to come, there was no profile, no testimony from his school friends or teachers, no sense of who he was, let alone why he was killed. A young man was removed from the planet in a Western country at peace and just got a paragraph. How can that be? So let me introduce you to Samuel Cordray Brightman, known to his family as Day Day. He was a sweet-tempered, fragile young man, a homebody whose best friend was his younger sister Whitney, who was often as not fought his battles for him. Just coming out of his shell, he had recently been elected vice president of his school council. The women in his extended family described him alternatively as a son they never had or wished they'd had. Such was the short life whose death received such short shrift in the Dallas media. I spoke to the reporter who'd written the paragraph, and to be fair, it was her task to record it, not to follow it up. So when the day was done, she handed the story over to the regular crime team, which would take up the weekend stories that they thought were worth running. Samuel's death didn't make the cut. And that didn't surprise her. Indeed, it would surprise very few, because Pleasant Grove, the area where Samuel was shot, is poor, black, and on the south side of Dallas, and is known disparagingly as Unpleasant Grove. Shootings were common there, she confirmed. And then she said, people are desensitized to it. They reason that's just where bad things happen. And I heard this refrain often when talking to the journalists who covered the day's shootings. Clearly, I was the only one who'd called them to follow up the story. And they would kindly rifle through their notes and tell me what they knew and if they'd been to the crime scene, what they'd seen. But invariably, when I asked if they had any contact details for the family members I could speak to, or if there'd been any developments in the investigation, they would explain somewhat matter-of-factly why they'd moved on. Unfortunately, homicides are not uncommon in that area, said one. Unless something unexpected happened, it just wouldn't be the kind of story we'd follow up on, said another. Now, as a journalist, I do understand this. I have no idea what happened to Eunice Yosef, an 8-year-old Haitian boy whom I met in the Dominican Republic in 2005. He turned up in a refugee center with his neck twisted from carrying heavy loads and his shoulders bearing welts from the mistreatment of the family who had bought him and used him as a domestic slave. Nor do I know the fate of Kulo Korban, whom I met in Sierra Leone in '98, who had both his ears and 3 fingers amputated by rebels in the conflict there. After a week reporting from both places, I moved on. I write this with neither pride nor guilt. There is a level of detachment inherent and arguably necessary in the profession. Without it, one would become emotionally depleted. Moreover, one is constantly gauging what more there is to say and who would be listening if you said it. Outlets have limited resources. Editors have to justify budgets for keeping you in a certain place or sending you back to trace each individual story, which in turn must be balanced against what other stories one might be missing. Journalism is not social work, and even social workers, to be effective, must move on. That said, I do also understand that these are little more than rationalizations for how I and other journalists exercise our relative power. We choose whose stories are told, whom we go back to, and where these resources are deployed. And these choices are not objective. They are made on the basis of what stories we subjectively consider are worthy of being told at any given time. The fact that most media outlets are commercial enterprises is, of course, a factor. The more a story costs and the less likely it is to bring in readers and therefore revenue, the less likely institutions are to invest resources in it. But it's not the only factor, and generally it's not the most important one. To no small extent, what the media does is to replicate and amplify the inequalities that exist elsewhere. Journalists are more likely, on both sides of the Atlantic, to be white, wealthy and educated than the population at large. And that means they are less likely to live in the areas where gun deaths and knife deaths happen, and less likely to know people to whom they happen. Journalistically, this remoteness comes at a severe price. They literally don't know the people they are writing about. In Ways of Seeing, John Berger wrote, "The way we see things is affected by what we know and what we believe. And the relation between what we see and what we know is never settled. And what's truly unsettling is that when some people see that a black kid's been shot or stabbed, they are far more comfortable blaming the kid and his family than the society that allows guns to circulate so freely and neighborhoods to decline so completely. And some of these people are journalists." It was intriguing to me when I was doing my book how many people immediately wanted to know how many of the deaths were gang-related, as though that might provide some acceptable context in which a child or teen might be shot. Victims become divided into the deserving and the undeserving. One of the things I noticed in doing the book was I always knew that segregation was a barrier to empathy, and that therefore, if you take a city like Dallas, which is hyper-segregated, that people would say, well, I don't know anybody down there, and that those people aren't like us. But what I didn't realize was that for many Americans, they looked at those communities as not being populated by people at all, but by a different species. A species where the parents didn't love their children and the children didn't love life, where the children were feral and the parents were negligent. The first comment in a short online story of Samuel's death came from Marge Vargas, who wrote, "I have 2 adult kiddos, and there's no way they would have been out walking the streets after dark. I always know where they were. I do not blame the victims, but all parents could do better." A mother just lost her child, and this was Marge's contribution to the discussion. There is no empathy here. The assumption is this simply could not have happened to her because she was a better parent. But then you find Samuel's mum, and you find out what happened that night, and that Samuel's friend Denzel, whose granny lives in the area, was over to take his granny to church the next morning. And Samuel invited Denzel, who went to his school, over for a family night. They watched We're the Millers, they drank cocoa, they played Uno. The worst thing Samuel did that night was cheat at Uno. When the night was over around 11, he said, "I'll walk you home." 6 minutes to his granny's house. And in that 6 minutes, Samuel was shot. Nobody knows why. It's not that his mum didn't know where it was, it's that she couldn't save him. And yet you see the assumptions of Marge Vargas. This is where the distance and the challenge of empathy comes in. Because the further you are from living in a community where a child might be murdered, the less likely you are to see it as a priority, its victims as newsworthy or solutions as possible. Put bluntly, a child being killed is a far more newsworthy event for those who know the child than for those who don't and are never likely to. It was also a shocking thing to me doing this book. Of the 10 kids who were killed that day, 7 were black, 2 Latino, 1 white, which is not average, it was random. So African-American kids were overrepresented. Every black parent, when you asked them, did you think this could happen to your child? Everyone said, oh, well, yes. Yes, I thought that. So Samuel's mum said, I didn't think it would be him, I thought it would be his brother. The father in Newark said, you're not doing your job as a black father if you don't think your child could be shot. And then there was a mother in Chicago who lived in the stairwell where another boy was shot that day, who said, that's why I'm glad my 14-year-old is in jail, because they can't shoot him there. And then there is the issue of the deserving and the undeserving victim. This notion that Marge Vargas would not let her children out after dark, which raises the question, what time is it okay for a child to be shot? 11, 11:30, is that when the shooting gallery starts? Quite often, African Americans, actually in most of the cases, felt the need to explain why their child should not have been shot. They would say he wasn't in a gang, he didn't do drugs, he'd never been in trouble with the police. That comes up again and again, and they are citing the reasons why their child should not have died. This is a Western country at peace. So news values aren't an objective account of the most important things that have happened in every given time and place. They are the sum total of the priorities and received wisdom of those who provide the news. And those who provide the news are not a representative group. Now, what I'm not saying here, and I couldn't emphasize this enough, is that the rich should not be able to write about the poor, or white should not be able to write about black, because that way madness lies. We should never underestimate our capacity to empathize, analyze, and engage beyond our own experience. It simply recognizes the distance between subject and object, the distance a journalist or organization will need to travel to remain both relevant, competent, and respected. What I am saying is, in the absence of diverse newsrooms, these problems become more acute. And at the point of having a critical mass of a range of different classes, ethnicities, religions, regions, and a gender balance in your newsroom is not to make you feel good, It's not so that you can look different and yet act the same. That might provide photo opportunities, but not equal opportunities. The point is that it enables news organizations to do their jobs better. And in doing their jobs better, they would find richer, more meaningful stories. Samuel's family is a case in point. They weren't hard to find, it's just that nobody bothered to try. And when I found his mum, it turned out that Audrey, his mum, was working for a firm that provided home help when her boss was indicted for Medicaid fraud. The lawyer told her she should leave the job or she could find herself caught in a legal web. And she took that opportunity to heed a doctor's advice and get an operation that she needed because it was a natural break in her working life. She needed this operation and she needed some weeks to heal afterwards. So she had the operation, she was healing, she was driving the kids to school one day when she was rear-ended by a driver who did not have insurance. And she was taken out of the car with what's called a deranged knee, and that meant she couldn't walk. So she was coming to the end of her healing process, and then she could no longer walk. She couldn't walk, so she couldn't work. She couldn't work, and her unemployment benefit ran out. She couldn't pay her rent, so she was evicted. She moved in with her sister for a while, and they got on very well. They called each other every day, but that's 2 grown women and 5 kids in a 2-bedroom flat. That wasn't going to last for long. And so she moved to Pleasant Grove, the one place that would take her shot credit, the place where black kids being shot isn't news. Now, there was a story here for anyone who wanted it about the precariousness of middle-class living in America, where 1 in 3 either live in poverty or struggle in the category that the census now terms the near poor. 1 accident away from the poorhouse. The descent from comfort to penury is precipitous and round every corner. It was a story hidden in plain sight. It just needed someone to take the blinkers off to see it and unshackle themselves from their assumptions to pursue it. This is less the product of malign neglect in journalism than the unconscious omissions born from the dead weight of power and privilege that makes the poor and the dark invisible in America and elsewhere. In short, there are places in every American city where children and teens are expected to get shot. Areas where the deaths of young people by gunfire doesn't contradict a city's general understanding of how the world should work, but confirms it. To raise children there, whether they're involved in criminal activity or not, is to incorporate those odds into your daily life. Just as Samuel's story revealed America's blind spots, so the story of the fatal stabbing of Kumari Serenkuma Barnes in Willesden, London, revealed many of ours. Kumari, who was 15, was killed on January the 23rd this year outside his school. Though he looked younger than his 15 years, he was, by most accounts, an old soul. He sang Wailers tunes when other kids were singing nursery rhymes. He could cook a full roast dinner for the family and stayed up all night for the 2015 general election, matching the results against expectations. He was singing to himself as he left school that day, only to be chased by another 15-year-old boy. He ran screaming for help and shouting, "I'm going to get stabbed." And later that evening, this short life ended when one of the 3 stab wounds pierced a lung. His death was front-page news in the London Evening Standard for 2 days running and received cursory coverage elsewhere in the country. The trial of his assailant came some 5 months later, starting just after the election. The tragedy at Grenfell happened shortly afterwards, so there was a lot going on. Nonetheless, and you have to remember, I was reporting from the States for 12 years, so I hadn't done much court reporting here. I imagined that there would be considerable interest in what came of this case, but it turned out that for most of the trial, only myself and a film crew doing a longer documentary were there. On the day of the verdict, there was just me and a court reporter. Watching the 15-year-old who had stabbed him in the dock that day, I wrote, "It's difficult to know what justice looks like when one 15-year-old is dead and another is on trial for their murder. Naturally, you want the perpetrator to be punished. But if the perpetrator is also a child, then on one level it seems as though some broader, deeper, more intractable injustice has already been committed. One thrashes around, mostly in vain, for an institution, service or agency to blame, for an intervention that could have helped, or a moral safety net with smaller holes that might have caught him. There are preferable outcomes, but there are no good outcomes. If the accused is found not guilty, then either the killer is still out there or he just got away with it. If he is guilty, then one child is still dead and the other's life is ruined. A few months later, after the accused had been convicted and then had confessed, I managed to reach the mother of the boy who'd killed Kwamari. And I felt this was important because, for the most part, fatal knife crime is reduced to a crude morality play in which the young perpetrators are all but invisible. Abstracted from parents or community, we meet them in the dock, defined by their crime. They're not children who have killed, but killers. Not people who have done something monstrous, but monsters. They stand reduced to this one act. They killed a child, and they are a child. Their anonymity protected by law, we do not see their pictures or hear from their parents. By the time the trial is over, we have no idea where they've come from, why or how, only where they're going. Prison. Without face, family or friend, they are not children, they are cautionary tales. But in order to heed the caution in these tragic crimes, we must first restore the humanity of those who commit them. Failing to do so is not only morally problematic, it's counterproductive. The best chance we have of sparing the next child from an early death is finding out why the last one died. And there are lots of lessons, but none can be learned if they don't start from the fact that this murder was committed by a boy, not a metaphor. When I found his mum, I discovered that the boy who killed Kwamari had been a happy kid, who graduated as a toddler from Finding Nemo to Lion King, deciding early on that he wanted to be a vet. A very active child, in later years he became an accomplished athlete and footballer who gained the attention of professional scouts. While in primary school, his dad was deported. That was the first time his mum noticed him getting angry and withdrawn. She tried to get help from the child and adolescent mental health services at the time, but was told he didn't meet the threshold. At secondary school, he seemed to be doing well academically, but before long he was expelled after an altercation with a teacher, and from there he was sent to a pupil referral unit. It was in talking to his mum that I discovered that the search for some broader injustice that might help shed light on Kwamari's death would not have been in vain. Indeed, she could document in painstaking detail requests for help that either weren't answered, weren't met, or whether the response was inadequate, even as she warned of the possible consequences. On 23rd of March 2015, she sent an email to her MP with a heading in capitals, "Please help me save my son." She described how the behavior of her then 13-year-old boy was deteriorating rapidly and he was involving himself with the wrong crowd, and her fears for the impact this could have on his siblings. She detailed how she had enrolled herself in parenting classes, consulted with social workers and psychologists, sought referrals for mental health assessments, requested to move him from his school, and asked for help to move her family out of London, but she felt she was getting nowhere. She ended the email, "All I want is for my children not to become another statistic, and would like all the help possible to stop this from happening." A few months later, she warned a meeting of social workers in Brent, the London borough where they lived, if we don't do something, either he's going to end up dead or someone's going to end up in a body bag. She tried. We don't know if that murder could have been prevented, but we know that not everything was tried. And at the bottom of many of the responses that she got from Brent Council came this very telling impersonal sign-off. Brent Council needs to save £54 million over the next 2 years. Find out more at our budget consultation events and have your say before February the 4th, 2015. Therein lies a story, because there is a structural context to these deaths that is willfully ignored. We must, of course, talk about personal responsibility, But there is also collective responsibility, particularly when we are referring to children and youth. They are a protected category. As a society, there is a general view that we have a responsibility for them. And the fact is that as a society, we are reneging on that responsibility. In 2011, the government scrapped the educational maintenance allowance, the £30 weekly grant to low-income students in school or college. Funding for the education of 16 to 19-year-olds fell 14% in real terms between 2010 and 2014, leaving sixth form colleges struggling for survival. Since 2010, there's been a £387 million cut in youth services, and between 2012 and 2016, 603 youth clubs were closed. In London, 28 million has been slashed from youth service budgets in the last 5 years. A starved NHS is unable to adequately provide mental health assistance to the young. The government now plans to cut funding to schools in urban areas. Once the government's made the political choices that effectively produce a crisis, it then expects the police to establish order and calm over the instability. Police say that young people who are carrying knives increasingly do so not through gang affiliation but for protection. Youth workers say they're scared and don't trust the police to protect them. In short, as a nation, we are actively and consciously underfunding our kids, and it's killing them. And these cuts fall more heavily on the poor, and since the dark are more likely to be poor, on those who are black or brown. These deaths are all too often understood or misunderstood as a crisis of culture and crime, of rap and grime, while the economic and political decisions that help create the context for them go unchallenged. In the event that the media wants to cover these stories, they hone in on the boy in the dock and in the body bag. They don't seem too interested in how they got there and what might be done to prevent others destined for the same fate. Now, few would make the claim that there's a direct and seamless causal link between austerity and the rise in violent crime. Government policy does not put a knife in a child's hand and encourage them to use it. But any insistence on personal responsibility has to be weighed with collective responsibility. Nor could anyone claim that it's the exclusive reason for the increase, but as the cuts go deeper, leaving vulnerable people more desperate, the contextual connection is compelling. If you make it harder for young people to stay in education, harder for them to get treatment if they're mentally ill, harder for them to find safe and productive places to spend leisure time with each other and with adults who are trained to work with them, then we should not be surprised to see an increase in social problems among the young, including social violence in general and knife crime in particular. As the boy in question's mother, the boy who killed Kumari, put it, is he responsible for his actions? Yes. Did I try everything I could? Yes. Well, we failed. Yes. The shock over Grenfell or Hurricane Katrina or the 2011 riots illustrates how the media episodically discovers the daily reality of these kind of people in much the same way that teenagers discover sex. Urgently, earnestly, voraciously and carelessly, with great self-indulgence but precious little self-awareness. They've always been aware of it, but somehow when confronted with it nonetheless takes them by surprise. And then their surprise becomes the news. Crikey, look what I found out, rather than the news itself. Goodness, look what's been going on while I've been looking elsewhere. This is why some people walk their dogs of an evening rather than listening, watching, or reading to what journalists have to say. After the suburb of Ferguson, Missouri went up in flames 2 years ago to almost universal condemnation in the media, the Department of Justice conducted a report into how the city was being run. I believe that the findings of that report any enterprising journalist could have produced if they had not become inured to this kind of systemic discrimination. Among other things, the Department of Justice found that between 2007 to 2014, one woman was arrested twice, spent 6 days in jail, and paid $550 as a result of one illegal parking incident, for which she was originally charged $151. She tried to pay in smaller installments, but the court refuses refused to accept anything less than the full payment, which she could not afford. 7 years after the original infraction, she still owed $541. And this was how Ferguson raised its revenue. It was not a glitch in the system, it was the system. And then there was a 14-year-old boy found in an abandoned building who was chased down by a dog which bit his ankle and his left arm as he protected his face. The boy says officers kicked him in the head and then laughed about it afterwards. Officers say they thought he was armed. He wasn't. Department of Justice investigators found that every time a police dog bit someone, that someone was black. It turns out that sometimes dog bites man really is the story, but journalists keep on missing it. Thank you.
Apart from the technical glitch in the middle. Gary's very kindly offered to answer some questions and have some discussion, so we've got 15, 20 minutes, I guess, to do that before we head out for a drink. So, and Angie's got the mic, so she's going to be running around. So, anybody want to raise their hand? Right over in the really far corner, Angie, right over there.
Okay, there's one here. Do you want to go here and then?
No, I think you go to the one right in the back. Then we'll come back.
It's a workout.
Oh, he's coming back.
Exercise. First of all, thank you very much for what you've had to say. And just a personal reflection whilst you were speaking, I remember being in the United States in 2013 with my best friend. We were driving around in a hire car. We were stopped many times by the police. The first time it happened, he said to me, okay, this is what you do. And he showed me the protocol of what you do as a black man when you're in a car in the United States to make sure you do not incur any wrath. That was my first thought whilst you were talking. It was a wow moment for me. Another point I want to raise is about local journalism. It's something that's certainly been raised here in Manchester quite a bit recently about the importance of it. And could you say something about how that's affected some of the things that you've mentioned in terms of the reporting of, how do we say this politely, the corruption of governance?
Yeah, well, local newspapers have had a really rough time. Actually, most what used to be called newspapers, and not anymore, they're called media organisations because they're not just papers, have had a rough time. And unless you have somebody with very deep pockets who's prepared to fund you, and pretty much everybody in the UK has that, apart from The Guardian, which is owned by a trust, then you're in trouble. It used to be that advertising paid for newspapers. Now people, get their news online. Revenue from online is not so great. Anyone, I'm going to say under the age of 30, thinks it's a human right that you shouldn't have to pay for news. And so will rarely actually pay for news. Last week I posted something, there was a review of the documentary, and I posted it was from the FT, and somebody tweeted, well, that's subscription, so I never do that, which I think we'll find, but don't be so proud about it because that's somebody's job, and that took work, and if people weren't doing that, you would wonder why. And so the funding of local news has really taken a battering. And as a result, the corruption that you talked about, the kind of one group of people that probably would have followed Kumari's story more would have been, the Kilburn Times or, whatever the local paper was. But that's now kind of 3 or 4 people doing absolutely everything, which means that local government can run amok, but also those issues that are closest and most, that touch people most urgently quite often simply aren't covered, and it's a big problem. It's one of the reasons why I think there is such a kind of a disconnect between the populace and the polity at the moment, because the information is not getting out and not getting through, and people start mistrusting everything and everybody.
Sorry, Angie.
It's all right. Didn't make it to the gym. Where are we going?
First of all, thank you as well for the talk. I've read your work for many, many years, and it's a real pleasure to seen you give this talk. It was a question on journalism in general, and it was that, do you believe as a journalist you are responsible in your work chiefly to the public or to your own personal interests when investigating and writing a story, and why is that?
I don't think I'm responsible to my personal interests. I mean, the thing is, nobody elected me, right? And so I'm not accountable. I think there is a, and I also think there are lots of things that are journalism that have real value that aren't the kind of things that I do. You know, TV reviews, and people who can write really funny, and satire and all that kind of stuff. And so if you were to then talk about your social responsibility to write fashion, well, I mean, I wonder what the social responsibility is there. I personally feel a couple of things. I feel a responsibility to the reality that I see, which is different from the truth in a sense. The truth is too big for anybody to grasp, but that I see my job or my task as being descriptive rather than predictive. So saying this is what I see, and then trying to interpret what I see, and because you, the reader, can't see it, and so I'm your eyes, and that's why it's important, even when you see things you don't like, to be faithful to what you see. And then I feel personally that there are some things other people want to do them, and that's great, because I don't want to do them. And that to me is the high politics stuff. So I personally feel that if something is already being covered by hundreds and hundreds of journalists, then why bother? What are you going to do that's different? So I like to be where others aren't. So on the night of Obama's election in 2008, he was in Grant Park in Chicago, and I thought, well, that is the most covered media space probably on the planet right now. So I went to a bar on the south side of Chicago called the President's Lounge and interviewed people there, and I found a guy the night before, and I went out with him and voted. And even when that's not the main, it's actually been quite, can be quite infuriating for my editors, because I don't want to do the main story. So when they asked me, in 2008, well, we're trying to get you on Obama's plane. I was like, well, I don't want to go on Obama's plane. That's the closer you get to Obama, the less you see. And while that might be an interesting story to tell my grandchildren, in terms of covering this election, it's more like stenography than journalism, really, to me. So I like to be where others aren't.
Those days at David Lloyd are paying off now.
God, you're really paying off.
Angie, sorry, a guy, just in the middle of that row, two
This
down
row?
from you and across,
Okay.
And then perhaps the woman behind, if you can pass it back to the woman behind after.
And then the woman, and then come back.
Thank you. No,
Don't be shy.
Well, my question being, my issue, what triggered me was in Manhattan, I was searched by the police because I was walking around with luggage. And then I told them, they searched my passport and said, oh, it's a British passport. Oh, that's fine, that's what we do. So
we'll send you on your way in a sec, we just got to look like we're working. Second one, knife crime's fun. Of course, I would be very blind, but I use my forearm to block the blow, so it was a couple of inches deep, injected into the wound that was horrifically painful, and I had to watch it as well. Is there an event in your life that has maybe triggered what you do now, or something that you derive on from a past experience that influences your style of your journalism itself?
That's a good question. I would say there are two things. They're bigger than really just shaping my career, but they shape my attitude, certainly. The first is that my mum died very suddenly when I was 19. And I was raised by my mum. My dad was not in the picture. And that gave me a series of lessons at a very early age. She died unexpectedly. She wasn't ill or anything. You only have one life. You don't take anything with you. And you should leave the planet in a better place than when you found it. And that guides much of what I do in my life. So, going on Obama's, I think there's only one, I don't want to do that in this life. You know what I mean? There's a limited number of things that I want to do, and that's not one of them. That would involve waiting to have grandchildren to tell them that story. And I might be dead by then. So there was that. The other one was a brief, I told you about living in Leningrad, but before then I lived in Paris for 6 months. And that was this brief moment in my life when I counted for nothing. So I ended up living, I would call and ask about renting a flat, and people would ask you what color you were, and either you told them, and it was better when they did, because if you didn't, that saved you a trip. Otherwise, you had to go, and then they would take a look, and then suddenly the place would be gone. And it was during the first Gulf War, which was 91, I think, 91, something around there. And I was stopped and searched about 3 times a week, probably 3 or 4 times a week, because I ended up living in an area where there were no black people. Convoluted story, but I ended up living in a fancy area. There were no black people. So just to go out and get a baguette at 7 o'clock in the morning made me suspicious. And then they would stop me. I had plaits, I was wearing sneakers, I spoke passable French. I was enrolled at the Sorbonne. Nothing about me made sense. And therefore, I was always held, and I was British. So then I would always be held for a kind of large period of time. Like, we've got a black kid here, says he's British, speaks passable French, says he's enrolled at the Sorbonne, says he lives around the corner, says he's getting a baguette. Check him out. So after a while, a rage can build in you when you are, because if that's happening to you 3 times a week, then that can happen to you at any time. And therefore you have to be constantly on guard for that kind of behavior. And there's a very good book by Andrea Levy called Never Far From Nowhere. And it's a very good book, it's a novel, but actually the title has always summed up my view, my feeling as a kind of black male in a Western society, which is that you are never far from nowhere. It wouldn't take long, and in some instances, it can still happen that people just say, well, that just doesn't make sense. You don't make sense to me, because my image of what you should be is not what I'm seeing here. And if you look at that clip of the interview that I did with Richard Spencer, there's this moment where he shows up and says, "You're the interviewer?" And you see it right there, and it's like, yes, I am. So that would be the other one, the period in Paris.
Do you think that the state of race relations in the UK is starkly different to that of in the US, given your experiences living in both countries?
Yeah, I do, yeah. I mean, I never deal in better or worse, because it's better here or it's worse there, because, not that you ask that, but people always want, where's it better to be? And it's like, well, if it's a difference between being unemployed or being shot or being kind of, stopped and searched, or like, if you have a series of bad things that you're asking me to choose from, then I'm just going to say, it's bad in both places. When I came back, there was a suggestion, often written into kind of introductions, and particularly because the book came out, that I came back because America was so racist. I would say, well, if I was trying to flee racism, I would not go to Hackney. But here's my, now my wife is African American, and so I am kind of, I do have some personal connection to that experience. And here's what I would say, that in many ways, I'm glad that I grew up in Britain. I'm one of 3 boys raised by a single black mother. Statistically in America, we're working class. Statistically in America, one of us would be dead or in jail, and we're not. Britain, for reasons of class, I had a hernia when I was 8, it didn't bankrupt my family. My mother was a nocturnal epileptic, that didn't bankrupt my family. I got the grades at school, and I could go to university. This will, blow the minds of your generation, but I could go to university. It didn't cost me a penny. The state paid for everything. They gave me a grant. There were no loans even then. That's how old I am. And when my mother died, they gave me more money to stay at university. And that's class that got me there. Most of that's because I was poor. Or from a poor family. Now, none of that would have been true for America. The trouble is that you get to that stage in Britain, and Britain doesn't know what the hell to do with you. And whereas America can handle multiracial inequalities, really poor white people, really rich white people, really rich black people. And so there does come a moment then when, if you want to thrive, you might want to go to the States. Not because it's not racist, but just because the class privilege of being rich in the States it can't protect you from being black, can't do that, but it can buy you an awful lot of kind of social capital and other things that it's going to be much harder to get here. Black America has centuries-old institutions in a way that Black Britain doesn't. It has a critical mass of people, which means that if Black America wants to launch a boycott, that matters in a way that if Black Britain wants to launch a boycott, it matters less because there are less of us, and we are, and less of us are rich. It has advocates at the highest level, including at one stage the presidency. So in America, you can get further and you can fall further, and there's something to both of those.
We're going to have one last question at the back, and then we will have time for drinks so people can maybe talk to Gary if we haven't worked you hard enough. I'm sorry. Okay, so one last question.
No pressure. Gary, just following up from the question that's just been asked, I just wanted to ask, in terms of journalism, especially in the UK, obviously the things of a lot of the shootings of black young men in America, a lot of the things about racism that's covered in the media in this country is like always, look over there, look what's happening in the US. And there's also, in that sense, what do you think that says about journalism in this country? having given us the details of the young man that was murdered and nobody followed up his story? What does that say?
I mean, there's long been this problem, and it's not just for race, that that people in Britain look to America as the future. And I think God help us if that's the future. You know, I don't want to live in a country with no health care. I mean, unless you've been there, it's very difficult to imagine. You're out with a friend, and you're like, well, you know, what's up? And they're like, oh, I've got this thing. You're like, well, you should get that sorted out. And they're like, well, I will when I get a job. This is the wealthiest country in the world, so-called. Black life expectancy in DC for a man is lower than male life expectancy on the Gaza Strip. I don't want that future. I don't want the guns. There are loads of things about America that I love, but I don't want it to be the future any more than I'd like Belgium to be our future, and I like chocolate and beer. So, and that's a general problem around a lot of things. But then we have this other problem here, because I've seen it, and this is one of those things where journalism, you can't really extricate journalism from the broader society. So we had a civil rights movement in Britain. The trouble is that for the most part, it took place abroad. It took place in Ghana with Nkrumah, and India with Gandhi, and across the developing world and the colonized world. And therefore, the amnesia here can be more prevalent in terms of not really kind of feeling or knowing our history. Both black people and white people, that British history is actually, in many ways, world history. My mum came in the early 60s with a British passport. Whereas America, because it all happened there are some things, much as people try, that just can't be avoided. And so, if you add that to America's clout in terms of economics and culture, then all of that stuff comes our way, and we've got nothing to resist it with. And so when you go into school, and it's Black History Month, then it's like Black British people don't have a history. It's all Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and there's no Septimus Severus or kind of all of the kind of, the Grunwick dispute or any of that stuff. And so there is some work to do here, some hard work for all of us, not just black folk, to reclaim and reinvigorate, really, our history, to breathe some life into this history. Because one of the things we need desperately at the moment, in this Brexit moment, is a different story. That the story that we have of this country is bizarre. Well, I'm going to put the great back into Great Britain. Well, you're not, are you? You're not. And what put the great, what did that? People will say, we won the war, or we won the World Cup. They'll never say we enslaved people or we colonized people. So, power has many parents, but the brutality that it takes to acquire is always an orphan. So we have to reclaim and retell our story as actually quite an urgent matter. And it's a story that is easily retold, because most of our literature doesn't make any sense without it. If you look at the classics of Vanity Fair or Jane Eyre or any of those things, they're all colonial stories. None of our habits, our tea, our this or that, none of that makes any sense unless you understand our history as always having been multiracial, actually, and always having been multinational, always having been cosmopolitan. And so I account for the fact that people look to America because America is the biggest and the baddest and the richest. And I think we have paid the price for that, all of us, not just black folk.
Thank you very much.